My name is Claire Mercer. I'm 29 years old. And on the night that was supposed to be the happiest of my life, I watched my own mother lean across the head table, smile at me like she always does, that soft, practiced smile, and pour something from a small glass vial directly into my champagne flute. I didn't see it clearly at first. The room was loud. The lights were warm. 200 guests were laughing, clinking glasses, taking photos. My husband Daniel was dancing with his grandmother 20 feet away. I thought maybe I'd imagined it. I hadn't. What happened over the next 6 hours? The dizziness, the confusion, the moment I realized what my parents had actually done and why, would unravel every lie my family had told me for the past decade. And it would hand me the one piece of evidence I needed to end their control over my life forever. But here's what they didn't know. 3 months before my wedding day, I had quietly begun building a case. Not because I'd planned any of this, but because something in me had finally started to wake up. Before I tell you what happened next, what was in that vial, what my parents were trying to prevent, and what I did when I found out the truth, I want to ask you something. If this story already feels familiar, if you've ever smiled and nodded while someone you loved made a decision about your life without you, please hit the like button and subscribe. Drop your location in the comments. Tell me where in the world you're watching from. Your presence here means more than you know. Now, to understand why my parents felt entitled to drug me at my own wedding, I have to take you back to the beginning. But before I take you back to the beginning, before I show you who my parents really are and why they did what they did, I need to pause right here. Because if you're still watching, you already know something is wrong with this picture. A mother. Her daughter's wedding day. A vial slipped into a champagne glass while 200 guests looked the other way. You felt it, didn't you? That sick twist in your stomach. That's not an accident. That's recognition. Some of you watching this have sat at a table with people who were supposed to love you, and felt underneath all the noise and the smiling and the clinking glasses, that something was deeply, quietly off. That the people raising a toast to you were not actually celebrating you. This story is for you. If it's hitting close to home, take a second right now and hit the like button. Subscribe if you haven't already. I share stories like this every week, real ones about people who finally stopped shrinking and started living. And drop a comment below. Tell me where in the world you're watching from and what time it is there. I read every single one. Now, to understand what was in that vial, and what my parents were so desperate to stop, I have to take you all the way back. Back to the house I grew up in. Back to the family that shaped me. Back to the version of Claire Mercer who would have quietly drunk that champagne, felt the dizziness come on, and told herself she was probably just tired. That Claire is gone now. Let me introduce you to her first. The Mercer family home sits on a wide, tree-lined street in a suburb of Cincinnati, Ohio. Red brick, black shutters. A wraparound porch my mother keeps decorated for every season. Pumpkins in fall, a pine wreath in winter, potted hydrangeas in spring. From the outside it looks like the kind of home that appears in insurance commercials. Warm. Stable. The kind of place where nothing bad could ever happen. That's exactly what my parents intended. My father, Richard Mercer, is a cardiologist. Respected, precise, the kind of man who speaks in full sentences and never raises his voice because he has never needed to. He doesn't intimidate through anger. He intimidates through disappointment. A long pause, a slow blink, a measured exhale that communicates more devastation than any shouting match ever could. He has high standards, people always say, as if that explains everything. As if high standards are a personality rather than a weapon. My mother, Diane Mercer, is the social architecture of the family. She organizes. She curates. She manages appearances with the precision of a publicist and the reach of someone who has spent 30 years embedding herself into every church committee, every neighborhood board, every parent association that ever existed in a 15-mile radius. My mother does not gossip. She gathers information and redistributes it strategically. There is a difference, she would tell you. Then there is my brother Philip. 4 years older. Pre-med at 17, medical school at 22, cardiology fellowship at 28. My father's replica, built to specification. Philip walks into a room and my father's face changes. Something loosens in his jaw, something brightens behind his eyes. A pride so physical you can almost see it land on his shoulders like a hand. And then there is me. Claire. The second one. The daughter. I don't say that with bitterness anymore. I say it the way a doctor reads a chart. Clinically, accurately, because the diagnosis matters. In the Mercer family I was the second one. The unexpected variable. My mother wanted a daughter, yes, but the version she had imagined. Poised, compliant, decorative, a younger extension of herself. What she got was a girl who asked too many questions, who preferred the company of books to country club brunches, who cried too easily and laughed too loudly and never quite learned to perform composure on command. I tried though. For years I tried. I took piano because my mother said it showed discipline. I quit after 3 years when it became clear I would never be exceptional, and my mother introduced me to tennis instead. I took tennis. I was mediocre at tennis. I took French, joined the debate team, attended cotillion, smiled in every holiday photo in the dress my mother selected. I became very good at performing the version of Claire that the Mercer family required for public consumption. At home it was different. At home I was managed. The word that comes closest to describing my childhood is managed. Not neglected, I was fed, clothed, educated, taken to the doctor. Not abused in any way that left visible evidence. But managed the way you manage a situation that has not resolved the way you planned. With patience. With careful redirection. With a steady low-grade pressure that never quite became a scene. My father managed through standards. Grades were not celebrated, they were expected. A 94 on an exam earned a question about the 6 missing points. A lead role in the school play earned a comment about how the drama department wasn't exactly a path to financial stability. He never told me I wasn't good enough. He simply responded to my achievements with the quiet suggestion that the bar was elsewhere and I had not yet located it. My mother managed through comparison. Not always with Philip, she was too sophisticated for that. She compared me to ideas. To potential. To the daughter she referenced in the abstract, the one who would have handled a situation more gracefully, would have known better than to wear that, say that, feel that so visibly in front of other people. That imaginary daughter haunted my childhood more than any real person could have. I was 15 the first time I understood that love in my family was not unconditional. It was contractual. The contract was simple. Perform correctly, reflect well, require nothing inconvenient, and you would receive warmth. Approval. Inclusion. Step outside the contract. Make noise, take up too much space, want something they had not pre-approved, and the warmth disappeared. Not loudly. Not dramatically. It simply went away like a light switched off in an empty room, and you were left to figure out what you had done wrong and correct it before it came back on. I spent most of my adolescence correcting myself. The one place I was allowed to exist without management was in the kitchen with my grandmother. My father's mother, Nana Jo. She was small and sharp-eyed and entirely unimpressed by the Mercer family's curated perfection. She'd grown up in rural Kentucky, raised 4 children on a schoolteacher's salary, and had zero patience for what she called performance living. When I was 12, she taught me how to make biscuits from scratch. When I was 14, she let me read whatever I wanted from her shelf without asking if it was appropriate. When I was 16, she looked at me across her kitchen table and said, "Claire, you are not too much. You're in the wrong room." I didn't understand what she meant then. I do now. I met Daniel Kowalski at 24 at a friend's housewarming party in Columbus, where I had moved after college to work at a nonprofit focused on housing advocacy. Daniel was a structural engineer. Quiet, deliberate, the kind of person who listened to the whole sentence before forming a response. He was not impressive by Mercer family standards. He didn't have a prestigious last name. He didn't summer anywhere. He drove a truck with a dent in the rear panel and thought the country club was the funniest concept he had ever heard. I fell in love with him in about 6 weeks. My parents' response was measured and immediate. My father asked 3 questions about Daniel's income trajectory, his firm's size, and his family background, in that order. My mother said he seemed nice in the tone she reserves for things she finds deeply inadequate. Philip said nothing because Philip never involved himself in anything that didn't concern his career. And then, collectively, the Mercer family entered what I now recognize as their management protocol. The steady, patient, long-game pressure designed to redirect me toward a more suitable outcome. It started subtly. My mother began mentioning other men. Former classmates who had done well. Sons of her friends who were established. She wasn't pushing, she said. She was just sharing. My father questioned Daniel's ambition regularly, not cruelly but persistently, the way you return to a loose thread. Does he have a plan? What does growth look like in his field? I just want to make sure you're thinking long-term, Claire. Then Daniel proposed. And subtle became something else entirely. My mother cried, but not the way you cry at good news. She cried the way someone cries when a situation has escalated beyond their ability to manage it quietly. My father went very still and asked if I had thought this through. Within a week, I was receiving forwarded articles about couples who married too young, too fast, too without considering compatibility on foundational levels. My mother requested we extend the engagement. Then extend it again. Then suggested premarital counseling, not because she believed in it, but because she had identified a therapist she trusted to surface the right doubts. I did none of it. I set the date. I booked the venue. I chose my dress without my mother's input, which produced 3 days of pointed silence and a comment about how she had simply hoped to be included. What I didn't know, what I had no way of knowing, was that my parents had moved beyond persuasion. They had begun to plan. And on the evening of my wedding day, surrounded by 200 people who believed they were witnessing a celebration, I would find out exactly how far they were willing to go to keep control of a daughter they had never quite managed to manage. The wedding was set for the second Saturday of October. Daniel and I had chosen a restored farmhouse venue 40 minutes outside Columbus. Exposed timber beams, string lights, a meadow that turned gold in autumn. Nothing like the formal ballroom my mother had lobbied for. Nothing like the guest list she had drafted, which somehow included 40 people I had never personally invited. We compromised where we could. We held our ground where we had to. And by September, with 6 weeks to go, I genuinely believed the worst of it was behind us. I was wrong. The breaking point didn't arrive as a single moment. It arrived the way pressure always does. Accumulated, incremental, disguised as concern until the disguise finally slipped. It started with the rehearsal dinner. Traditionally, the rehearsal dinner belongs to the groom's family. Daniel's parents, Frank and Carol Kowalski, who drove down from Cleveland in a minivan with a cracked windshield and brought a cooler full of homemade pierogi, had planned a simple dinner at a Polish restaurant Daniel had loved since childhood. 40 people. Long tables. Real food. The kind of evening where someone's uncle tells a story that goes on too long and everyone laughs anyway. My mother called me 8 days before the rehearsal to inform me she had concerns. Not objections, she was careful to say. Concerns. About the impression the venue would make. About the out-of-town guests who had traveled far and deserved something reflective of the occasion. She had already, just as a thought, just to have the option, spoken to the event coordinator at the club about availability. I told her the rehearsal dinner was the Kowalskis' event to plan. She said she understood that, of course. She just wanted to make sure I had considered how it would look. I called Daniel that night. He was quiet for a moment and then said, very evenly, Claire, your mother just called my mother. Carol Kowalski, who is one of the warmest people I have ever met and who had never once made me feel like a variable to be managed, had apparently received a 40-minute phone call from my mother expressing her concerns about the restaurant choice. Carol had listened politely, thanked her for sharing, and then called Daniel the moment she hung up. I sat on the edge of our bed for a long time after that call. This was the moment I first felt it. Not anger, not yet, but something colder. A clarity. The recognition that my mother was not going to stop. That the boundary I thought I had drawn was, to her, simply an obstacle she hadn't yet found the right angle to move around. That my wedding was not, in her mind, my wedding. It was a Mercer family event that I happened to be starring in, and she was the producer, and producers do not surrender creative control because an actor requests it. I called her back. I told her, as calmly as I could manage, that she was not to contact the Kowalskis directly about planning decisions. That if she had concerns she could bring them to me. That the rehearsal dinner would proceed as Carol and Frank had planned it, and that was final. My mother said, "I hear you, Claire." Which is not the same as agreeing. The rehearsal dinner happened at the Polish restaurant. The pierogi were extraordinary. Frank Kowalski gave a toast that made Daniel cry, which made me cry, which made Carol cry and then laugh at herself for crying. My parents sat at the end of the table in their pressed clothes and smiled the smiles of people enduring something. My father checked his phone twice. My mother rearranged the centerpiece. They left before dessert. That was a Thursday. On Friday, the day before my wedding, my mother asked to meet me for lunch. Just the two of us, she said. Mother and daughter. One last afternoon before everything changed. I should have known. We met at a restaurant near my parents' house. A quiet place with white tablecloths where my mother had been having lunch with her friends for 20 years. We ordered. We talked about the weather, the flowers, the timeline for the next day. My mother was warm. Kind of. She reached across the table and held my hand and told me I had grown into a remarkable woman and she was proud of me. And then, with the same seamless transition she had been executing my entire life. The pivot from warmth to management so smooth you almost missed the seam, she told me she had spoken to someone. A lawyer, she said. Family friend. Just for information, just to understand. She slid a piece of paper across the table. It was a summary. 1 page. Printed cleanly, no letterhead. It outlined, in plain language, the concept of a postnuptial agreement. What it could cover, how it could be structured, what it would protect. I'm not saying anything is wrong, my mother said. I just think it's wise to be informed. Your father and I have spent 30 years building something. There are assets in this family, Claire. There's a legacy. And Daniel he's lovely, he really is. But we don't fully know him yet. We don't know his family's financial history. We don't know. I stopped her. I folded the paper in half and set it back on her side of the table. I told her that I was marrying Daniel tomorrow. That I trusted him completely. That his family's financial history was not her concern, and neither was my marriage. I told her that I loved her and I wanted her at my wedding and I wanted it to be a good day for both of us. But that if she brought this up again, if she contacted Daniel, if she contacted a lawyer, if she introduced one more concern between now and the ceremony, I would ask her not to attend. My mother looked at me for a long moment. Then she folded her hands in her lap and said, "You've always been so reactive, Claire. I hope you'll reflect on that." I drove home with my hands tight on the wheel. That night, Daniel could tell something was wrong. I didn't want to tell him. Not the night before our wedding, not when he was happy and calm and deserving of one uncomplicated evening. So I told him my mother and I had disagreed about something small. He accepted that. We ordered Thai food and watched a film we'd already seen twice and fell asleep on the couch. I lay there in the dark for a long time after he drifted off, staring at the ceiling, telling myself it was almost over. That tomorrow we would be married. That once we were married the leverage would shift. That my mother would eventually, finally, inevitably, accept the life I was building and find a way to exist inside it without dismantling it. I believed that then. What I didn't know, what I had no reason to suspect even after everything, was that the paper my mother slid across the table at lunch was not her plan. It was her opening move. The actual plan had already been set in motion. And it was waiting for me in a champagne glass at the head table of my own wedding reception, 22 hours away. Here is something nobody tells you about planning a wedding while managing a family like mine. You become very good at compartmentalization. You learn to hold two realities simultaneously. The beautiful one you are building with the person you love, and the complicated one that keeps bleeding in from the edges. You learn to smile at the florist while your mother's voicemail plays in the back of your mind. You learn to taste cake samples and discuss centerpiece heights and debate ceremony music while some quiet, vigilant part of you remains permanently braced for the next thing. I had been compartmentalizing my entire life. The wedding just gave me more to carry. But in the 3 months before the ceremony, something else was happening. Something I hadn't planned. Something that began not as a strategy but as a feeling. A slow, gathering certainty that I could no longer afford to simply react. That if I kept waiting for my parents to reach a limit they were never going to reach, I would spend the rest of my marriage running the same play I had run my entire childhood. Yielding. Absorbing. Recovering. I needed to understand what I was actually dealing with. It started with a conversation I wasn't supposed to hear. 6 weeks before the wedding, I drove to my parents' house to drop off some paperwork, vendor invoices my mother had offered to review, which I now recognize was itself a form of control, her insistence on being administratively embedded in the planning. I let myself in through the side door the way I always had. The house was quiet. I assumed no one was home. My father was in his study on a phone call. The door was half open. I wasn't eavesdropping. I was 3 steps down the hallway before I caught my own name and stopped. Not about whether we like him, Richard, it's about what happens if this goes wrong. Claire has no prenuptial protection, nothing is documented, and you know how she is. She doesn't think ahead. He never has. Pause. My father's voice lower. I know. I've spoken to her. She won't hear it. Another voice. A speakerphone, tinny and precise. A man I didn't recognize. Then you have other options. It doesn't have to be confrontational. There are ways to introduce. Let's call it friction. Enough to slow things down, create space for reflection. What kind of friction? Nothing irreversible. Something that gives her pause. Gives her time to reconsider before a legal commitment is made. Once you're past the ceremony, your options narrow considerably. I stood in that hallway for what felt like a very long time. Then I walked back to the side door very quietly and let myself out. I sat in my car in my parents' driveway for 20 minutes before I trusted myself to drive. My hands were shaking. Not from fear exactly, but from the disorienting sensation of having a suspicion confirmed that you had hoped, somewhere, was only a suspicion. That voice on the phone was not a family friend. The language was too precise, too clinical. Options. Friction. Nothing irreversible. That was the language of someone being paid to solve a problem. I was the problem. I drove home. I didn't call Daniel. I didn't call anyone. I sat at my kitchen table with a notebook and I wrote down everything I had witnessed over the past 3 months. The phone call to Carol. The lawyer's summary at lunch. The extended engagement pressure. The forwarded articles. The therapist's suggestion. Every incident, every date, every direct quote I could remember. I filled 4 pages. Then I turned to a fresh page and wrote 2 words at the top. What else? Because here is what I had learned growing up with Richard and Diane Mercer. What you could see was never the whole picture. My parents did not operate on the surface. They operated in depth, in layers, in the quiet space between what was said and what was meant. If I could hear a phone call about introducing friction, then the friction was already being introduced somewhere I hadn't looked yet. I needed help. Her name is Sasha Oram. We had been friends since college. She was my roommate sophomore year, a pre-law student from Atlanta who argued for sport and kept a color-coded calendar that I found simultaneously intimidating and deeply comforting. Sasha had gone on to become a family law attorney in Columbus, specializing in exactly the kinds of situations that most people don't realize require a lawyer until it's too late. I called her on a Tuesday evening, 3 weeks before the wedding. I told her I thought my parents might be planning something. I told her about the phone call, the lawyer summary, the phrase nothing irreversible. I told her about the pattern, the years of management, the escalating pressure since the engagement, the way my mother had seamlessly shifted from persuasion to something that felt more organized. Sasha listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Claire, I want you to do something for me. Before the wedding, I want you to document everything. Bank accounts, assets, anything jointly held or potentially contested. I want you to know exactly where you stand financially and legally so that whatever they're planning, if they're planning anything, you're not walking into it blind." I asked her if she thought I was overreacting. She said, "I think you've been underreacting for years and your instincts are finally catching up. Trust them." Over the next 2 weeks, I did exactly what Sasha asked. I pulled records. I reviewed my own finances. Modest savings, a small investment account I had opened at 26, my car, my personal assets. Nothing complicated. Daniel and I had discussed money openly. We were planning to merge finances gradually after the wedding, beginning with a joint account for household expenses while maintaining individual accounts in the interim. Clean, simple, transparent. Then I looked at the Mercer side. My parents had always been private about money in the specific way that wealthy families often are. Not secretive exactly, but sealed. Finances were not discussed at the dinner table. Inheritances were referenced but never detailed. My father's practice was successful. My mother's family had come from old Cincinnati money that nobody quantified aloud but everyone understood was present. What I found when I started looking carefully was not criminal. It was not even necessarily sinister, not on its face. But it was interesting. 3 years earlier, my parents had restructured a family trust. A trust that had previously included both Philip and me as equal beneficiaries. The restructuring had been quiet. No family meeting, no conversation, no explanation. Philip remained a primary beneficiary. My position had been reclassified to contingent, meaning I would inherit only under specific conditions, conditions that were outlined in the trust document but that I had never been shown. I obtained a copy through Sasha. The conditions were detailed. I had to be married, to someone the trust defined, in language that had clearly been drafted carefully, as a person of demonstrable financial stability and professional standing. The definitions were vague enough to be interpreted broadly. Vague enough, I understood as I read them, to be contested. I sat with that document for a long time. I wasn't devastated by the money, I want to be honest about that. I had built my own life, modest and independent, and I had never factored an inheritance into any plan I had made. What devastated me was the architecture of it. The deliberateness. Someone, my parents, their attorney, or both, had sat down and constructed a legal mechanism designed to give them ongoing leverage over my choices. Not just who I married. Whether the marriage counted. Whether Daniel would ever be deemed acceptable by a definition they controlled. The friction, I now understood, was not just personal. It was structural. I called Sasha back. She reviewed the document and confirmed what I suspected. The language was unusual. Not unenforceable necessarily, but unusual. Subjective in ways that could be exploited. She advised me to document the trust details, retain copies of everything, and be very alert in the weeks leading up to the wedding. Alert to what specifically? I asked. Anything that could be used to cast doubt on Daniel's character, your judgment, or the validity of the marriage itself. If they want leverage, they need evidence. If they're planning to create it rather than find it, that's where things get complicated. I hung up the phone and sat very still in my apartment. Outside, Columbus moved through an ordinary October afternoon. Leaves turning, traffic moving, the world proceeding in total indifference to the quiet war being waged inside a red brick house on a tree-lined street in the suburbs. I thought about the voice on the speakerphone. Nothing irreversible. I thought about my mother's face at lunch, the paper slid across the white tablecloth, the measured warmth that preceded the pivot. I thought about Nana Jo in her kitchen, telling a 12-year-old girl who had not yet learned the word for what she was feeling. You are not too much. You're in the wrong room. And I made a decision. I was not going to wait to see what they had planned. I was not going to walk into my wedding reception hoping for the best while braced for something I couldn't name. I was going to be ready. Not reactive ready. There is a difference. Reactive means you absorb the blow and then respond. Ready means you see it coming and you change the geometry of the room before it lands. I called Sasha one more time. I told her I wanted to document everything from this point forward. Every conversation with my parents, every interaction in the week before the wedding. I told her I wanted to understand exactly what my legal position was if something happened at or around the ceremony. I told her I needed to know what nothing irreversible might look like in practice. Sasha was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Claire, I think you should also consider telling Daniel." I hadn't told him yet. Not the full picture. I had protected him from it. Or told myself I was protecting him, which I now recognize was the same instinct I had spent a lifetime applying to myself. The instinct to absorb privately. To manage alone. To not burden the people I loved with the weight of what I was carrying. But Sasha was right. I told Daniel that night. All of it. The hallway, the phone call, the trust document, the conditions, the word friction spoken in my father's study by a voice neither of us knew. Daniel listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and took both my hands in his and said, "Okay, what do we do? Not are you sure? Not maybe you're reading too much into it." Not the careful, managed, redirecting response I had been trained my entire life to expect from the people who were supposed to be on my side. Just, what do we do? I looked at him across the kitchen table in our small Columbus apartment and I understood, in the specific way you understand things that rearrange something permanent inside you, that I had made exactly the right choice. Whatever was coming, we would face it together. And whatever my parents had planned for the second Saturday of October, the vial, the champagne glass, the thing I had not yet seen but was already in that moment moving toward us, they had made one critical miscalculation. They still thought I was alone. The morning of my wedding was cold and clear. I woke at 5:30 without an alarm, the way you wake when your body understands that something significant is coming and refuses to let you sleep through the approach of it. Daniel was still asleep beside me. I lay there for a few minutes in the dark, listening to his breathing, feeling the particular stillness of a day that hasn't started yet. Then I got up, made coffee and sat at the kitchen table with my phone and reviewed everything one last time. Sasha had sent me a summary the night before. Clean, bulleted, precise in the way she was always precise. It outlined my legal position, the trust document anomalies, and a short list of things to watch for. She had also, at my request, arranged for a trusted colleague of hers to be present at the reception as a guest. Not obviously. Not in any way that would register. Just present with eyes open in case anything needed to be witnessed and documented by someone with professional standing. I had not told my parents this. I had not told my parents a lot of things. I read the summary twice, put my phone face down on the table, and drank my coffee in the quiet of an October morning while the city outside slowly came to light. By 7, I was at the farmhouse venue with my bridesmaids. By 9, the florist had transformed the barn into something that looked genuinely dreamlike. Warm light through timber beams, autumn flowers in copper vessels, long tables dressed in linen the color of cream. Carol Kowalski arrived at 10 with her sister and immediately began crying at the centerpieces, which made everyone else cry, which felt exactly right. My mother arrived at 10:30. She was dressed beautifully. A deep burgundy dress, pearl earrings, hair set perfectly. She embraced me at the entrance to the bridal suite, held my face in both hands, told me I was breathtaking. Her eyes were bright. Her smile was the warm, practiced one I had known my entire life. She was performing. I knew that now in a way I hadn't always known it. But I smiled back with equal warmth and equal precision because I had spent 30 years learning from the best. "You look wonderful, Mom," I said. "This is going to be a perfect day," she said. We held each other's eyes for just a moment longer than necessary. Then she moved into the room to greet the bridesmaids, and I exhaled slowly through my nose and the day continued. The ceremony was at 2 o'clock. I will not spend long here because this part belongs entirely to Daniel and me, and some things are not for analysis. I will say only that when I walked down the aisle on my father's arm, my father who had restructured a trust to manage me, who had spoken to a stranger about introducing friction into my life, I looked straight ahead at Daniel. Not because I was ignoring my father, but because Daniel was where I was going, and I had decided that morning that nothing happening at my periphery was going to pull my focus from that. Daniel cried during the vows. So did I. Frank Kowalski in the second row produced a handkerchief the size of a small flag and used all of it. We were married at 2:47 in the afternoon on the second Saturday of October, in a restored farmhouse barn outside Columbus, Ohio, in front of 200 people who believed they were witnessing a celebration. They were. It was also something else. The reception began at 4. This is where I need you to pay close attention, because the next 2 hours are where everything I had been quietly preparing for finally arrived. And it arrived as these things often do, not with a dramatic entrance but with something small. Something easy to miss. Something designed to be missed. The cocktail hour passed without incident. Daniel and I moved through the room table to table, accepting embraces and congratulations. My parents were gracious and visible. My father shaking hands, my mother laughing with her church friends, both of them performing the role of proud parents with the fluency of people who had been performing their entire adult lives. I watched them without appearing to watch them. Sasha's colleague, a quiet woman named Andrea, whom I had met once briefly and would not have recognized as anything other than a guest, was stationed near the bar with a glass of white wine, talking easily with Daniel's cousins. She caught my eye once, briefly, and gave me nothing. No signal, no nod. Just the calm, neutral expression of someone who was paying attention. Dinner was served at 5:30. The head table seated 8, Daniel and me at the center, flanked by our respective parents and the maid of honor and best man. My parents were to my left. Frank and Carol were to Daniel's right. The seating had been my mother's suggestion, which I had accepted because changing it would have required an explanation I wasn't ready to give. The first hour of dinner was ordinary. Speeches, laughter, the kind of warmth that fills a room when people are genuinely happy and fed and slightly wine-loosened. Frank gave a toast that referenced 3 separate fishing metaphors and somehow made all of them work. My maid of honor, a college friend named Becca, gave a toast that was so honest and funny and exactly right that I grabbed her hand under the table and held it through the applause. My father gave a toast. It was polished. Of course it was. He thanked the guests, praised the venue, said several true and complimentary things about Daniel that landed like an audition rather than a sentiment. He raised his glass. Everyone drank. My mother smiled throughout. Then at 6:45, Daniel was pulled away from the table. It was his best man, Marcus, a friend since university who was constitutionally incapable of brevity, who materialized at Daniel's shoulder needing him for something, just for 5 minutes, photos with the groomsmen that the photographer needed before the light changed completely. Daniel squeezed my hand, excused himself, and was gone. I was alone at the head table with my parents. This, I would later understand, was not a coincidence. I had been watching my mother all evening. Not obviously, not in any way she would have registered, but with the specific attention of someone who has finally learned to read a language they grew up speaking without understanding. And in the 20 minutes before Daniel left the table, I had noticed something. My mother kept looking at my champagne glass. Not staring. Not obviously. The way she looked at it was exactly the way she did everything. Briefly, casually, as if her attention were elsewhere. But I had watched her do it 3 times. A glance away, a glance away. The 4th time, her eyes moved to her clutch bag on the table beside her, then back to the room. I said nothing. I moved nothing. I kept my expression exactly where it was. 2 minutes after Daniel left, my mother turned to me. "Claire, your father wants to get a photo with just the 2 of you before it gets too late. He's been asking all evening and you know how he is about photos." She touched my arm, warm and light. "Just 2 minutes. I'll keep your seat." My father was already standing, already gesturing toward the far end of the room where a photographer was positioned near the floral arch. I looked at my mother. I looked at my glass. I looked back at my mother. "Of course," I said. I stood, smoothed my dress, and walked with my father toward the photographer. I did not look back. But I had done something before I stood up. Something small. Something that took less than 4 seconds and would have been invisible to anyone not specifically watching for it. 3 weeks earlier, when Sasha and I had discussed what friction might look like in practice, what a family like mine might do to introduce doubt, to create a narrative, to produce a reason for a marriage to be questioned before it legally solidified, she had walked me through scenarios. Academic, she called them. Just so we understood the landscape. One of them had been pharmaceutical. Not poison, nothing irreversible after all. But certain substances, she explained, in sufficient dosage, could produce effects that looked like instability. Confusion, emotional dysregulation, behavior that could be characterized by the right witness as concerning. As evidence of a pre-existing condition. As grounds, potentially, for a legal argument about capacity. It sounded almost too calculated to believe. Until I watched my mother glance at my champagne glass 4 times in 20 minutes. When I stood up from that table, I left my champagne glass where it was. The glass I carried to the dance floor, the one I had been sipping from all evening, I had switched with an identical glass from the adjacent place, setting 40 seconds before my mother suggested the photo. It was a clean swap. Unhurried. The kind of movement that registers as nothing because it looks like nothing. Someone reaching across a table. Someone adjusting a glass. My original glass sat in my mother's careful proximity. I stood beside my father under the floral arch and smiled at the camera while the photographer counted down. My father's hand was on my shoulder, warm and correct. He said something about being proud of me. I said I was glad he was here. Across the room at the head table, I could see my mother from the corner of my eye. I watched her reach for my glass. I watched her look left, look right, look at the room with the practiced casualness of a woman who had spent 30 years managing appearances. I watched her unclasp her clutch. The photographer said, "Beautiful, one more." I smiled. My mother's hand moved over my champagne glass for less than 3 seconds. A gesture so small, so controlled, so entirely consistent with a woman simply adjusting something on the table in front of her, that no one who was not already watching for it would have seen anything at all. I saw it. Andrea saw it. Andrea, who was not a wedding guest but a licensed private investigator and notary with a camera pen in the breast pocket of her blazer, captured it in clear, time-stamped footage from 11 feet away. My father released my shoulder. The photographer lowered his camera. My father said something about getting back before the cake was cut. Of course, I said. Let's go back. We walked back to the head table together, my father and I, through 200 people celebrating a marriage that my parents had spent 3 months trying to prevent and the last 45 minutes trying to contaminate. Daniel was already back at the table, laughing at something Marcus had said, his jacket slightly loosened, completely happy. He looked up when I sat down. "Everything okay?" I picked up my glass. The switched glass, the clean glass, the one my mother had never touched, and I smiled at my husband. "Everything is exactly where it needs to be," I said. He clinked his glass against mine. My mother, to my left, watched me bring the glass to my lips. I did not drink from it. I set it down, turned to Daniel, and said quietly, close enough that only he could hear, "It happened. Andrea got it. Don't react." He didn't react. That was the moment I understood, completely and without any remaining doubt, that I had married exactly the right person. The cake was cut at 7:30. The first dance followed. The band played something slow and the room gathered in a warm circle, and Daniel held me in the middle of the dance floor of a barn outside Columbus while 200 people watched us and thought they were seeing the whole picture. They were not seeing the whole picture. In my mother's champagne glass, the one sitting untouched at the head table where I had left it, was the original contents of my drink. Whatever had been added to it was sitting in that glass, waiting. And in Andrea's blazer pocket was 11 seconds of time-stamped footage. The trap my parents had built over 3 months, with legal architecture and careful planning and the cold patience of people who had never once believed they would be caught, had just closed. Around them. The dancing lasted until 9. I moved through it the way you move through something when two realities are operating simultaneously. The visible one warm and celebratory, full of music and spinning and the particular joy of a room full of people who are genuinely happy for you, and the invisible one, precise and cold and ticking quietly underneath everything like a clock you can hear but cannot see. Daniel and I danced every dance we had planned. We cut the cake. We took photos with every table. We laughed at the right moments and held each other at the right moments and were, by every visible measure, exactly what we were supposed to be on the second Saturday of October. Newlyweds. Present. Grateful. Nobody watching us would have known. At 8:15, while Daniel was occupied with his grandmother on the dance floor, a slow song she had specifically requested, a detail Marcus had arranged in advance because he understood that some moments need to be protected, I slipped away from the reception room and met Sasha in the narrow hallway outside the bridal suite. She had arrived an hour earlier. Not as a guest, she had no invitation, no seat at the table. She had come in through a side entrance that Andrea had confirmed was accessible and had been waiting in the hallway with her laptop and a document I had signed 3 days before. She looked at me with the calm, steady expression of someone who processes extraordinary information as a professional requirement. Andrea sent the footage, she said. I've reviewed it. It's clean. Time-stamped, unobstructed, continuous. You can clearly see the hand movement and the contact with the glass. And the glass? Still at the table. Untouched since you switched it. I need you to get it to me without disrupting the room. I had already thought about this. I had asked Becca, my maid of honor, my closest friend, the one person besides Daniel I had brought fully into this, to manage the glass retrieval. Becca, who had listened to the full situation with the focused intensity of someone filing everything for future use, had agreed without hesitation. Her job was simple. At a natural moment, clear the head table of glasses in the way any attentive maid of honor might during the transition between dinner and dancing. Normal. Unremarkable. A small act of tidying. She had transferred my original glass, sealed in a Ziploc bag she had kept in her evening clutch, to Sasha's waiting hands at 8 o'clock. Sasha had sent it immediately to a courier already arranged, already waiting outside. It was on its way to a private laboratory in Columbus that Sasha had used before, one that could process a rush talk screen and return preliminary results within 48 hours. We would not have the results tonight. We did not need them tonight. Tonight I needed something different. Tell me what I have, I said. Sasha turned her laptop to face me. The document on the screen was the trust. The restructured Mercer Family Trust. The one that had reclassified my inheritance to contingent status 3 years earlier without my knowledge or consent. Beside it, in a second window, was a legal brief Sasha had prepared over the previous week. It was 22 pages long and it outlined in meticulous detail 3 things. First, the trust language was challengeable. The subjective definitions of financial stability and professional standing that my parents had used to construct my contingency conditions were vague to the point of legal vulnerability. A competent family law attorney, which Sasha was, could argue bad faith in the restructuring, particularly given the documented pattern of parental interference in my relationship with Daniel. Second, the footage Andrea had captured constituted evidence of potential criminal conduct. Administering a substance to a person without their knowledge or consent, regardless of the substance's classification or the dosage, met the threshold for a criminal complaint in the state of Ohio. The complaint did not need to be filed immediately. But it existed. It was real. And it gave me something I had never had in 30 years of being managed by Richard and Diane Mercer. Leverage. Third, and this was the part that I had asked Sasha to prepare because I needed to see it written down before I believed it was possible. There was a path. A clear, documented, legally supported path by which I could, if I chose to exercise it, contest the trust restructuring, file a protective order, and insulate my marriage and my assets from any further interference by my parents. Permanently. The path was not simple. It would require time, process, probably conflict. But it existed. It was real. You have everything you need, Sasha said. I stood in that hallway for a moment looking at the screen. I thought about the 12-year-old girl in Nana Joe's kitchen, learning to make biscuits because it was the one room in her life where nobody was managing her. I thought about every apron I had metaphorically worn, every performance I had delivered, every time I had smiled the Mercer smile and said of course when I meant something entirely different. I thought about Daniel at the kitchen table in our small Columbus apartment, taking both my hands and saying what do we do without hesitation, without doubt. I thought about my mother watching me bring a champagne glass to my lips. Okay, I said. Let's finish this. I went back to the reception. My parents were at the bar when I found them. My father with a scotch, my mother with white wine, both of them composed and social, receiving the last rounds of congratulations from departing guests. They looked like what they had always looked like from the outside. Distinguished. Settled. A family that had done well and knew it. I waited until the guests around them had moved away. Then I stepped into the space they had left and stood in front of my parents. My father with his scotch, my mother with her wine, both of them looking at me with the warm, slightly tired expressions of people who believed a long evening was almost over. Can we speak privately? I said. Just the three of us. My mother glanced around the room. A quick, reflexive check for audience. The same check she had been making her entire life. Of course, sweetheart, she said. Is everything all right? Everything is fine, I said. I just need 5 minutes. We moved to a small anteroom off the main reception hall. A narrow space with a window, a bench, a coat rack holding the overflow from the evening. My father closed the door. The music from the reception filtered through the wall, muffled and warm, entirely at odds with the quality of the silence in that room. My father looked at me with the expression he used when he expected a conversation he had already prepared for. My mother clasped her hands in front of her. I let the silence sit for exactly long enough. Then I said, I know what you put in my drink. The room changed. It didn't change visibly. Nobody moved, nobody made a sound, the coats on the rack did not shift. But something in the air of that small space altered so fundamentally that it was almost physical. My father's expression did not collapse. It reconfigured. The prepared version, the one that had been ready for whatever conversation he had anticipated, was replaced by something that took a fraction of a second longer to construct. Something tighter. Controlled in a different way. My mother said nothing. But her hands, clasped in front of her, pressed slightly harder against each other. Claire, my father said. His voice was steady. Of course it was. I don't know what you think. I'm not asking, I said. I'm telling you what I know. I'm telling you because you need to understand what exists before you decide how to respond. I spoke for approximately 8 minutes. I told them about the hallway. The phone call I had heard 3 months ago, the voice on the speakerphone, the word friction. I watched my father's jaw tighten by a fraction when I described the voice. He had not known I was in that hallway. He had believed that conversation was private. I told them about the trust. The restructuring, the contingency conditions, the vague language that Sasha had already begun documenting for a potential challenge. I watched my mother's hands loosen and then recompress. I told them about the footage. 11 seconds, time-stamped, clear and continuous, capturing a hand moving over a champagne glass at 6:47 in the evening at the head table of my wedding reception. I did not describe Andrea. I did not explain the logistics. I simply told them the footage existed and that it was already in the possession of my attorney. I told them the glass had been collected and sent for analysis. I told them I had not called the police. I told them I was not calling the police tonight. And then I told them why. Because I don't want to destroy you, I said. I want you to understand what you've done. I want you to sit with that understanding. And then I want you to make a different choice. My father opened his mouth. I held up one hand. I'm not finished. He closed his mouth. I told them what I needed from them going forward. Not a performance of acceptance. I was done with performances from all sides. Not a relationship that looked correct from the outside while operating on management and leverage underneath. What I needed was simple, and I said it plainly. I needed them to withdraw. From my marriage, from my financial decisions, from the quiet, sustained campaign they had been running since Daniel proposed. I needed the trust restructured, not in my favor necessarily, but fairly, with language that did not constitute a legal mechanism for parental control over an adult child's choices. I needed those things documented and signed, with Sasha present within 30 days. If those things happened, the footage and the talk screen results would remain in Sasha's files, unopened for as long as my parents honored the terms. If they did not happen, if anything occurred in the next 30 days that constituted interference, contact with Daniel's professional network, legal action against the marriage, or any further attempt to introduce friction of any kind, Sasha would file the criminal complaint the following morning. I finished speaking. The room was very quiet. My father set his scotch down on the bench beside him with a careful, controlled movement that I recognized as the physical equivalent of buying time. He looked at my mother. She looked at him. Something passed between them. The same kind of look that had passed between them at the anniversary dinner table in the story that opened this series. The look of two people who have operated as a unit for so long that they can communicate entire negotiations in a glance. Then my father looked at me. And for the first time in my life, the first time in 30 years of being assessed, managed, redirected, and measured against a standard I had never been given the specifications for, my father looked at me and did not have an answer. Not a prepared one. Not a managed one. Not a response that had been pre-constructed in anticipation of a conversation he thought he understood. He looked at me the way you look at someone you have underestimated so thoroughly and for so long that the recalibration is almost too large to process in real time. My mother made one attempt. "Claire," she said, her voice softer than I had ever heard it, stripped of the warmth as performance quality it usually carried. "Just soft. Just human. We were trying to protect you." I looked at her for a long moment. "I know you believe that," I said. "I think you've believed it for 30 years. I think you love me in the only way you know how to love me. And I think that way has caused me more damage than you will ever fully understand." She said nothing. "But that's not tonight's conversation," I said. "Tonight's conversation is about what happens next. And what happens next is your choice." I straightened my dress. I looked at both of them one last time, my father without his answer, my mother without her performance, and I opened the door of the anteroom. The music flooded back in, warm and immediate. 200 people in a barn outside Columbus, entirely unaware that 3 people had just negotiated the terms of a permanent realignment in a room full of coats. Daniel was on the dance floor. He saw me the moment I walked back in. He read my face the way he had learned to read it. Not projecting, not assuming, just attending. He crossed the room. "How'd it go?" I took his hand. "Stunned," I said. He pulled me onto the dance floor without another word. We danced. 30 days passed. I want to tell you they passed easily. I want to tell you that the confrontation in the anteroom, the footage, the talk screen, the 8 minutes of plain documented truth, produced an immediate and clean resolution. That my parents signed the documents, restructured the trust, withdrew from the perimeter of my marriage, and that we all moved forward into a new chapter with the hard-won clarity of people who had finally said the true things out loud. It wasn't that simple. It never is. The first week after the wedding, my mother called 4 times. I did not answer. She left voicemails that moved through a progression I recognized immediately. The first 2 were warm, almost casual, as if the anteroom conversation had not happened and we were simply overdue for a chat. The third was cooler. The fourth was my mother's most sophisticated instrument, the one she had deployed my entire life with surgical precision. Quiet, wounded disappointment. "I just hope we can find a way through this, Claire. I hope you know how much we love you. I hope you don't look back on this time and regret the distance you're creating." I played that voicemail for Sasha. Sasha listened to the whole thing, made a note, and said, "Classic Darvo. Document it and don't respond. DARVO, she explained when I asked, stands for deny, attack, reverse, victim and offender. It is the pattern by which someone who has caused harm reframes the situation so that the person who named the harm becomes the aggressor. My mother had not invented this pattern. She had simply been practicing it for 30 years without knowing it had a name. Knowing it had a name helped. My father called once on day 8. His message was brief and uncharacteristically stripped of performance. He said he had spoken to their attorney. He said he understood the terms. He said he needed more time to process. I texted back, "You have 30 days. The clock started on the wedding night." He did not respond. But he did not do nothing. On day 19, Sasha received a call from my parents' family attorney, not the voice from the speakerphone, a different one, older, someone my father had used for estate matters for 20 years. The attorney was professional and careful and conveyed, without admitting anything, that his clients wished to discuss the terms of the trust restructuring. Sasha conveyed with equal professionalism that her client was available and that the conversation should happen in writing. The documents arrived on day 26. I sat at the kitchen table with Daniel and Sasha on a Thursday evening in early November, leaves down, Columbus gone gray and quiet outside the window, and I read through 23 pages of revised trust language that Sasha had negotiated over the preceding week. The contingency conditions were gone. My position as a beneficiary was restored to equal standing with Philip. The subjective definitions, the language about financial stability and professional standing that had functioned as a parental veto over my choices, had been removed entirely and replaced with clean, standard inheritance law language that required no interpretation. There was also a separate document, a letter, 2 paragraphs signed by both my parents. It did not use the word apology. I had not asked for an apology. I had learned, somewhere in the process of the previous 3 months, that an apology extracted under legal pressure is not the same thing as an apology, and pursuing one would only extend a negotiation I needed to end. What the letter said, in the careful, structured language of people who had spoken to an attorney before writing it, was that my parents acknowledged having taken actions intended to influence my marriage and that they committed to ceasing those actions going forward. It was not enough. It was also all there was. I signed the trust documents. I kept the letter. The footage and the talk screen results remain in Sasha's files. The preliminary talk screen, which had come back on day 3, had identified traces of a mild anxiolytic, a class of anti-anxiety medication that in sufficient dose can produce confusion, emotional dysregulation and impaired judgment. Nothing irreversible. The precise phrase from the speakerphone, now attached to a compound in a laboratory report. I have never asked my mother directly where she obtained it or whether she understood what she was doing. I have thought about that question many times. I have held it from different angles, turned it in my mind the way you turn something heavy. And what I have concluded, not with anger, not anymore, but with the sad and specific clarity of someone who has finally read the whole document, is that my mother understood exactly what she was doing. She had understood for 30 years. She had simply never believed she would be caught. Here is what I want to tell you about the year that followed. Daniel and I moved. Not far, 40 minutes outside Columbus. A house with a porch and a yard and enough space to breathe in a way our apartment never quite allowed. We painted every room ourselves over 2 weekends in late November, music playing, paint in our hair, the particular joy of making something yours for the first time. I kept working at the nonprofit. Daniel kept building, literally, structurally, with his hands and his calculations and his quiet satisfaction in things that hold weight. We built a life together the way you build a life. Incrementally, imperfectly, with more laughter than drama and more ordinary Tuesdays than extraordinary moments. Carol Kowalski called every Sunday. Frank sent us fish he caught, frozen and labeled in his handwriting, which made Daniel unreasonably happy. Nana Joe, who had moved to a small assisted living facility in Cincinnati 2 years earlier, came for Thanksgiving. She sat at our new table with her sharp eyes and her zero patience for performance living and looked around the room at the paint colors we had chosen and the mismatched chairs and the evidence of a life built on our own terms. And she said, "There it is." Just that. There it is. I understood exactly what she meant. My relationship with my parents is not repaired. I want to be honest with you about that because I think honesty matters more than resolution. And because I know that some of you watching this are hoping I will tell you there is a version of this story where everyone gets what they need and the wound closes cleanly. Sometimes the wound does not close cleanly. My parents and I are in contact. Carefully, with distance, with the specific formality of people who have renegotiated the terms of a relationship and are still learning to operate inside the new ones. We see each other at significant events. We are cordial. My mother has not attempted to manage me since the anteroom. Whether that is genuine change or simply the recognition that the old tools no longer work, I cannot tell you. I'm not sure it matters. What matters is the boundary. The boundary is not a wall. A wall is built to keep something out permanently and requires constant maintenance and eventually cracks. A boundary is different. A boundary is a clear articulation of what you will and will not accept, held consistently without apology, without the need for the other person to understand it or agree with it. A boundary does not require permission. It does not require validation. It only requires you, your own clarity, your own steadiness, your own willingness to enforce it when it is tested. My boundary with my parents is this: I will engage with you as adults. I will not perform for you. I will not manage your feelings about my choices. I will not accept interference in my marriage, my finances, or my life, and I will respond to interference with the same directness I used on my wedding night. Every time. That boundary has been tested twice in the year since the wedding. Both times I held it. Both times my parents recalibrated. It is not the relationship I would have chosen. It is not the family I would have designed. But it is an honest one, finally, and honesty is more sustainable than any performance I have ever managed to maintain. Here is what I know now that I did not know at 22 or 25 or 28, standing in my mother's kitchen at family events I had worked for hours and wondering why I felt invisible in a room full of people who were supposed to love me. Being managed is not the same as being loved. It can look like love from the inside. It can feel like love to the people doing it. But love does not require your compliance to survive. Love does not need you smaller in order to feel secure. Love does not restructure a trust to retain leverage over your choices or introduce a substance into your champagne glass to slow you down. Love says, "What do we do?" Love says, "There it is." Love says, "Welcome home." I found that love. Not in the red brick house with the wraparound porch and the performance of family. I found it in a small Columbus apartment with mismatched furniture and a man who listened to the whole story and didn't ask me if I was sure. I found it in a lawyer who answered my call and said trust your instincts when I needed to hear it. I found it in a maid of honor who kept a Ziploc bag in her evening clutch without a word of complaint. I found it in a grandmother who saw a 12-year-old girl clearly and told her what she needed to hear 15 years before she was ready to use it. You do not have to earn that love. You do not have to perform for it. You do not have to make yourself smaller or more manageable or less inconvenient to deserve it. You just have to be willing to choose it. Even when choosing it is the hardest thing you have ever done. Even when choosing it means standing in an anteroom at your own wedding reception and laying down 30 years of truth in front of the two people who were supposed to protect you from exactly this kind of moment. Even when choosing it means driving away from a house you grew up in and not looking back. Especially then. If you have made it to the end of this story, I want to ask you something directly. Is there a room in your life you have been staying in too long? A relationship operating on terms you did not agree to, managed by a dynamic you have never named out loud? Is there a version of yourself? The one who asks too many questions, who feels too much, who wants things that haven't been pre-approved, that you have been quietly suppressing in order to keep a peace that doesn't actually feel like peace? You're not too much. You're in the wrong room. The right room exists. I promise you it does. It might be 40 minutes outside Columbus, paint in your hair, mismatched chairs. It might be somewhere you have not found yet. But it is real and it is waiting, and you do not need anyone's permission to walk toward it. If this story resonated with you, if any part of Claire's experience felt familiar, if you recognized the managed smile or the contracted love or the particular exhaustion of performing in a room that was never really yours, please hit the like button. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe so you're here for the next one. And leave me a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what room you're finally leaving. I read every single one.